Anton Chekhov wrote The Cherry Orchard during the last year of his life. The Cherry Orchard is a play about the passing of an era. The play portrays the social climate of Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, when the aristocrats and land-owning gentry were losing wealth and revealed themselves to be incapable of coping with their change in status. Let's see the summary of the play. The Cherry Orchard opens in the nursery of Lyuba Ranvisky's estate. Although it is only about 2 a.m., it is close to daybreak, for it is May, when northern Russian days are long and the sun rises very early. Lopakin, a businessman, and Dunyasha, a maid, anticipate the arrival of Mrs. Ranvisky, who is returning home from a self-imposed 5-year exile with Anya and her governess Ivanovna. Lopakin speaks of his peasant background and his admiration for Mrs. Ranvisky. Then the pair are briefly joined by the bumbling clerk Epikhodov, nicknamed 22 Calamities. After arriving, the travelers enter, preceded by first a manservant. They are soon joined by Varya, Lyuba's adopted daughter, Leonid Gaev, Lyuba's brother, Semyonov Pishik, a neighboring landowner, and Lopakin and Dunyasha. The reunion is very tearful. Ranvisky sweeps about the room, overcome with joy. The family members all display great emotion, weeping uncontrollably, not just over each other, but over the cherry orchard and house, even the nursery and its furniture. Lyuba is a generous but impractical sentimentalist. She tears up 2 telegrams from France without reading them, because, as she says, I have finished with Paris. Yet she daydreams of her happy youth and imagines at one point that she sees her mother wandering through the cherry orchard. Gaev, as his sister, has a screw or 2 loose. He carries on a perpetual game of Mendel billiards and weeps fondly over the nursery's bookcase. Pishik, also eccentric, seems less senile than mad. When Mrs. Ranvisky starts to take some medicine, he grabs her pills and swallows the lot on impulse. First, the old family retainer is simply feeble. He constantly trails off his mental path into inarticulate muttering. As the dialogue's comic shuffle continues, unpleasant truths intrude. Mrs. Ranvisky is broke and in her absence has not made interest payments on the mortgage. The estate is to go on the auction block in August. Lopakin proposes a practical solution. He advises Lyuba to divide the estate into lots and lease them out for vacation cottages. Even though that will mean the house and orchard, Gaev, who considers Lopakin an upstart peasant, is incensed and dismissive, calling the businessman's proposal utter nonsense. He, Lyuba, and Furs simply extol the virtues of the orchard as impractical as it has become. Pishik, too, is facing the loss of his estate through his failure to pay mortgage interest. He tries to get a loan from Mrs. Ranvisky. Rebuffed, he consoles himself with the idea that something is bound to turn up. The arrival of the eternal student, Peter Trophy, from a university for his radical politics, prompts a new round of weeping. The forgetful Pishik repeats his request. Mrs. Ranvisky tells Gaev to lend him the money, but Gaev refuses. After Mrs. Ranvisky goes off, Gaev, Varya, and Anya discuss possible solutions to her financial woes. Gaev doubts that their great aunt, the countess, will help because Lyuba had offended her relative by marrying beneath herself. But he buoys his niece's hopes by promising to borrow money on his own while encouraging Lyuba to ask for help. Then, completely exhausted, all the characters save Peter Trofimov leave the room and go to bed. In Act 2, the scene shifts to outside a chapel near the orchard. Sunset approaches. Charlotte, Yasha, who is First's ambitious grandson, and Dunyasha sit on a bench. Nearby, Epicuro plays a guitar. After Charlotte ponders her heritage, Epicuro stops playing to remark on fate and his uncertainty about shooting himself. When Charlotte and the clerk leave, Dunyasha confesses her love for Yasha. She is overcome by the smoke of his cigar and also leaves the scene. Mrs. Ranvisky, Gaev and Lopakin enter. Lyuba, distraught by her admitted extravagant lifestyle, drops her purse, scattering gold coins on the ground. Yasha picks them up while she voices regrets about wasting money on lunch. Lopakin again presses her to agree to his plan, but she finds his proposal vulgar, making him momentarily furious. She speaks of the death of her son and her affair with the scoundrel who left her destitute, then tries to convince Lopakin to marry Varia. With Gaev's overcoat, he is followed by Trofimov, Anya and Varia. Talking with Lopakin, Peter voices his disgust for the Russian intelligentsia, while Lopakin, the self-made man, speaks of his great success at making money. As the sun sets and the air grows still, they hear the melancholic sound of a breaking string. For a moment, they try to identify its source, but they are interrupted by a drifter asking for a handout. Lyuba, foolishly generous, gives him one of her gold coins. After the rest leave for dinner, Anya and Peter talk. He identifies the orchard with old decadent Russia and tells Anya that she must abandon it to find true happiness. Then, as they are called by Varia, the pair exit towards the river to be alone. The setting changes in Act 3. It is night, the day of the auction, during a party at Mrs. Ranvisky's estate. Enter the drawing room from the ballroom, where a band plays and guests dance. They await the return of Gaev, who with money borrowed from a countess had gone to town to try to save the estate. A forced gaiety keeps the mood superficially buoyant. Pishik complains about his debts are blunted by Charlotte's clever ventriloquism and magic tricks, but Mrs. Ranvisky's apprehension surfaces in her confession that she intends to return to the wretch of a man who had fleeced and deserted her. Later, Mrs. Ranvisky and Peter get into an argument over the heart versus the head. Trofimov claims that he is beyond love for Anya. Lyuba ridicules him for being a pseudo-intellectual. Angry, Peter storms from the room, promptly falling down a flight of stairs. A spreading rumor of the estate's sale momentarily upsets Mrs. Ranvisky, soon dancing with Pishik, who once more presses her for a loan. Thereafter, Epicuro, scorned by Dunyasha, gets into an argument with Varia, who attempts to beat him with a billiard cue but accidentally hits the arriving Lopakin instead. However, the blow does nothing to dampen his spirits, for it is he who has bought the estate. Lopakin gives a long self-congratulatory and triumphant speech, leaving Mrs. Ranvisky in tears with only Anya to console her. Act 4 happens in October. It is now October and the setting is again the nursery, the room except for some odd furniture. In the distance, an axe is heard. A woodsman has begun felling the cherry trees in the orchard. The family members getting ready to depart have deposited their luggage near the front door. Lopakin encourages everybody to share some champagne, but his enthusiasm only earns him bitter remarks from Trofimov. Anya enters, questioning whether the ailing first has been taken to the hospital. No one seems quite sure. Dunyasha then professes her love for the disdainful Yasha, who plans to return to Paris with Mrs. Ranvisky. Dunyasha will Alkodov instead. Mrs. Ranvisky enters with Gaev, Anya and Charlotte. She gives a tearful goodbye to the house, sadly reconciled to her fate. Gaev is more optimistic. He has secured a job in a bank. Pishik too has had some luck. He has managed to escape ruin through leasing some clay-rich property. Concerned about Varia, Mrs. Ranvisky pushes Lopakin to propose to her stepdaughter. The businessman seems willing enough, but when left alone with Varia, Neither is able to broach the subject. Near the end, after the others depart for the embrace in a tearful farewell, they too leave, and for a moment the stage is bare. Then first enters, forgotten and left behind. Dejected over his fate, he plops down on a sofa and lies motionless. The doleful sound of the breaking string is heard again. Then at the final curtain, only silence save the echoing act.